That summer was supposed to be about nostalgia, a final stretch of sun-soaked freedom before the weight of adulthood settled on our shoulders. The lake house had always been our sanctuary, a place where time slowed and the outside world felt distant. Edward and I had spent countless summers there, our days bleeding into nights, laughter echoing off the water. But from the moment I arrived, something felt different, as if an invisible current had shifted beneath the surface. The air was thick with humidity. The scent of pine and sun-warmed wood clinging to my skin as I stepped onto the porch. Edward greeted me with his usual boyish grin, but it was Mr. Lucas who unsettled me. His presence loomed in a way I hadn't noticed before, broad shoulders framed against the golden dusk, a slow sip from his glass as his gaze lingered just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that the awareness creeping up my spine was misplaced. Yet, when his eyes met mine, something flickered there, assessing, knowing. A shiver prickled over my skin despite the heat, and I suddenly knew, deep in my gut, that this summer would be unlike any before it. The lake house stood still in the golden afternoon light, nestled deep in the woods where the world outside barely seemed to exist. It had always been my escape, a place of freedom where nothing felt too heavy. But that summer, the air carried a different weight, an unspoken tension that clung to me no matter how hard I tried to shake it. Edward had barely been there an hour before Paige called, asking him to drive into town. I waved him off easily, playing it cool, though I secretly hated being left behind. Alone, I wandered down to the dock, letting the heat press against my skin. The sound of water lapping against the wooden planks a steady rhythm beneath my feet. And then, there was Mr. Lucas. I hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly, he was there, standing a few feet away, his presence unmistakable. He had discarded his shirt, the sun casting deep shadows along his sculpted torso. He looked effortlessly at ease, swirling the ice in his drink, watching me with something unreadable in his eyes. "Not swimming?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost teasing. I shrugged, suddenly too aware of the way his gaze moved over me. "Maybe later." He took a slow sip from his glass, the ice clinking softly. "Shame," he murmured, his smirk barely there, but impossible to miss. The air between us shifted, thicker, heavier. And for the first time, I felt something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. The late afternoon heat was thick, pressing down against my skin as I wandered back toward the house. I had planned to pass the time until Edward returned, maybe read on the porch or take a nap. But as I stepped inside, I found Mr. Lucas already there, leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping something dark and amber from a glass. He looked up as I entered, his sharp blue eyes flickering with something almost amused. "Quiet without him around, isn't it?" I swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence that wrapped around us. "Yeah," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Kind of weird, actually." He nodded, setting his drink down. "You could use the sauna while you wait. Heat works wonders for tension." His gaze flickered, lingering just a second too long. I just turned it on. I hesitated. "I don't know." "Come on." He cut in smoothly, pushing off the counter. "Consider it a proper welcome." Before I could think of a reason to refuse, he was already leading the way, his confidence leaving no room for argument. The sauna was small, tucked beside the boathouse, its wooden walls still fresh with the scent of cedar. The second I stepped inside, the heat wrapped around me, sinking deep into my muscles, making my limbs feel heavy. I exhaled slowly, letting my towel drop onto the bench as I sat down. Moments later, the door creaked open again, and Mr. Lucas stepped inside. He locked eyes with me as he closed the door behind him. And just like that, we were alone. The heat of the sauna pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, making every breath feel slower, heavier. Mr. Lucas sat across from me, his towel draped loosely around his waist, his posture completely at ease. He stretched, rolling his shoulders back, the movement drawing my attention to the broad expanse of his chest, the light sheen of sweat glistening along his collarbone. "You're tense," he observed, his voice smooth, almost teasing. I shifted, adjusting my posture, suddenly hyper-aware of how small the space felt. "It's just the heat," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if that was the truth. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You should let it work on you," he murmured. "Loosen up." The suggestion hung in the air between us, charged, unspoken in its true meaning. His gaze never wavered, watching me with an intensity that sent an unexpected shiver through me despite the temperature. Then, just as I started to look away, he shifted, his leg brushing against mine. It was a fleeting touch, barely more than a whisper contact, but it sent something electric through my veins. My breath caught, my pulse thundering in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, just an accident. But when his fingers ghosted against my knee, slow and deliberate, I knew better. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, but I didn't, and he knew it. The days that followed were an exquisite kind of torment. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overanalyzing every glance, every lingering pause in conversation. But the weight of Mr. Lucas's attention clung to me like a second skin, impossible to ignore. It was in the way his eyes traced me when he thought no one was looking, in the way his touch would linger just a second too long when he passed by. A hand at the small of my back as he reached past me for glass, the brush of his fingertips against mine when he handed me a plate at dinner. Subtle, barely perceptible, but each moment sent a quiet thrill racing through me, a reminder of that heated exchange in the sauna. Edward didn't notice, oblivious in the way only a best friend could be. He cracked jokes, dragged me into late-night card games, and talked endlessly about the summer ending and all the things we had to do before leaving for college. I tried to lose myself in our easy, familiar friendship. But when Mr. Lucas entered a room, the air shifted, thickened. And I knew. The worst part wasn't that I felt it. It was that he knew I did. That night, after Edward had gone to bed, I stepped onto the back porch, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. But I wasn't alone for long. I heard the creak of the door, the quiet shuffle of bare feet against wood. Couldn't sleep. Mr. Lucas's voice was low, smooth as warm honey. I exhaled slowly, bracing myself. This was only the beginning. The late summer air was thick, clinging to my skin as I stood on the back porch, trying to steady the restless energy curling inside me. I told myself I had come out here for fresh air, to clear my mind, but deep down I knew better. I could still feel him, his presence lingering in my thoughts like the remnants of a dream I couldn't shake. I heard the creak of the door before I turned, already knowing who it was. Mr. Lucas stepped onto the porch, the soft glow from the house casting long shadows across his frame. He was effortless, barefoot, a loose-fitting t-shirt barely concealing the strength beneath. His gaze found mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice deep, smooth. I swallowed hard. Something like that. He moved closer, just enough that I could feel the heat of him, the quiet weight of his presence settling against me like a gravity I couldn't escape. You've been avoiding me, he murmured, his voice edged with amusement. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. He saw right through me. Mr. Lucas reached out slow, deliberate, his fingertips grazing my wrist, just a whisper contact, but it sent a jolt through me. My pulse thrummed in my ears as he leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. You can run from this, Charles, but we both know you won't. And the worst part? He was right. The night air was heavy, thick with unspoken words and a lingering tension that had been building between us for days. I could feel it in the way my skin burned beneath his gaze, the way every nerve in my body was attuned to his nearness. I should have left. I should have walked away before I found myself in this moment, trapped between what I knew was wrong and what my body refused to deny. Mr. Lucas exhaled slowly, watching me with a quiet intensity that made my breath falter. He stood at the threshold of my room, his presence filling the space as if he belonged there, as if he had always belonged there. The dim light cast deep shadows across his face, making the sharp edges of his jawline even more pronounced. You know this is inevitable, don't you? His voice was low, smooth, coaxing me closer with nothing but words. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching at my sides. You shouldn't be here. And yet, he murmured, taking a slow step forward, you haven't asked me to leave. The distance between us disappeared, his warmth seeping into me like a fever I couldn't shake. His fingers brushed against mine, an unspoken question lingering in the air between us. My body betrayed me before my mind could catch up. My breath hitched, my pulse hammered, and still, I didn't move away. His lips hovered near my ear, his breath warm as he whispered, "Tell me to stop, Charles." But I didn't. I couldn't. The silence between us crackled, thick with something neither of us could name, something neither of us had the strength to resist anymore. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast long, golden shadows across the room, flickering against the walls like the remnants of a dying fire. Mr. Lucas stood before me, his presence overwhelming, his gaze steady, unreadable. I should have told him to leave. I should have turned my back, walked away, pretended like none of this had ever happened. But when he reached out, tracing a slow, deliberate path down my arm with the tips of his fingers, I knew there was no going back. My skin burned beneath his touch, every inch of me hyper-aware of the weight of the moment. "You don't have to fight this," he murmured, his voice rough with restraint. A shiver rolled down my spine as his palm pressed against my chest, his warmth sinking into me. I felt my breath falter, my resolve slipping through my fingers like sand. His eyes searched mine, waiting, giving me one last chance to say no. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the space between us, my hands finding his waist, my lips parting as he pulled me in. The kiss was slow, measured deep. His fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, grounding me in the heat of him. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty, only the undeniable truth of what we had both been waiting for. The morning after felt different. The world outside remained unchanged, the soft hum of the lake stretching lazily beneath the rising sun, the scent of pine drifting in through the open window, the distant call of birds greeting the day, but inside, everything had shifted. I lay still, my body tangled in warm sheets, the echoes of last night pressed into my skin. My lips still tingled from Mr. Lucas' touch. My breath still carried the memory of his whispered name. For a moment, I let myself exist in that quiet space, the weight of him still lingering in the room, even though he was already gone. I ran a hand down my face, exhaling slowly, trying to convince myself that this wasn't as monumental as it felt, that I could simply get dressed, walk downstairs, and pretend that nothing had happened. But as I sat up, the slight ache in my muscles told a different story, a reminder that I had given in, surrendered to something I couldn't take back. Footsteps sounded outside my door, and my heart leaped into my throat. A moment later, Edward's voice carried through the hallway, casual, unsuspecting. "You up, man? Breakfast is ready." I forced my voice to stay even. "Yeah, beat you down in a sec." I swallowed hard, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The guilt should have been suffocating, but instead, all I could think about was the way Mr. Lucas had looked at me in the dark, the way he had touched me like he already knew I wouldn't regret it. The final morning at the lake house was thick with unspoken words, the air carrying a weight neither of us acknowledged. Edward was busy packing up the last of his things, oblivious to the way my hands trembled slightly as I zipped my bag. Every moment of last night was etched into my skin, burned into my thoughts. And yet I forced myself to move as if everything was the same, as if I hadn't let myself sink into something I shouldn't have, as if I wasn't already craving more. Downstairs, Mr. Lucas stood by the kitchen counter, his fingers curled loosely around a coffee mug, his expression unreadable as his eyes locked onto mine. Just one glance and my breath hitched. He knew I wouldn't forget, that I couldn't. Edward's voice cut through the tension, breaking the silent current between us. "Ready to go?" I nodded too quickly. "Yeah." But as I stepped toward the door, Mr. Lucas' voice, low and smooth, slipped beneath my skin. "See you around, Charles." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. And as I walked out into the sun-drenched morning, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to escape this, or if I was already waiting for it to happen again.